Welcome back to another video feature of the Immersive World Handbook. Maybe as you can tell, I am back at World Expo 2015 Milan, and I'm going to take you through the coffee cluster. Exciting for me because I'm a big coffee fiend, so I wanted to take you around and again show you some of the smaller nations that are present within this particular cluster. And one of the things you're going to notice initially is the striking design that marks it off from some of the other nation clusters. You can take a look at that now as we walk around. Okay, and first off, I'm showing you here a conceptual image. One of the cool things you can find on the Expo 2015 website is a virtual walkthrough. And sometimes I think it's kind of fun to see the design standpoint given by the architects and the designers, and then compare that to what we're going to see in some of the images and also the video. I also wanted to share this slide with you, which is from the Expo website, that talks about the concept behind the coffee cluster and how you go through these 4 thematic sections, going from the coffee bean into the actual cup of coffee that probably many people, myself included, enjoyed while being in this cluster. And the other thing to note in all the clusters is that there's a sense of unity given to the overall structure of the different pavilions, and at the same time there is difference obviously entailed in each of the individual nations that you're going to see. But just now I'm focusing on some of the architecture, both day and night. The nations included that you're going to see include Burundi, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Ethiopia, Guatemala, Kenya, Rwanda, Timor, Uganda, and Yemen. And you can see, I think, what is effective about the design here is the fact that they used, and this may seem obvious, right, but they used the dark, rich, earthy coffee color. And again, you see corporate sponsors here. Little informational plaque which describes the idea behind the coffee cluster. They did some cool things in terms of the seating areas where people could just sit and mingle on bags of coffee beans. And you can see they did a lot with the signage. And again, I have to say that the design is absolutely outstanding. I mean, it's just such a beautiful area to look at in terms of the cluster. See a few more images here, and then we'll start the video walkthrough through the coffee cluster. Okay, and we're seeing some of that now. As you can see here, they have coffee beans that you can touch. I think they did a nice job with the murals there, and then you can actually look at what a coffee tree looks like. This is one of these things, I think, living in a consumer society, we don't necessarily see the production side of things, and that's one nice facet here as I'm pointing at the coffee trees of going to an expo, is the fact that you can actually then see things like production processes, how things are made, and so forth. And of course this is key when your expo theme is food, as it is this year. Okay, now we're entering the first of the pavilions here, which is Kenya. And you'll see here that they've highlighted, you certainly think of Kenyan athletes. So you see that reflected there on the left as you walk in. One of the things I discovered with the clusters, and I think everybody else did as well, it's like, well, you don't want to stand in line for Russia or China, Germany for 2-3 hours, so you go into the clusters. Well, a lot of people figure that out, and so these buildings are not necessarily designed to hold, I would say, more than 30-40 people comfortably, but I think at times that started to swell to 50-60 people at one time, which is a little hard to manage. Okay, we jump ahead a little bit and we're going into Burundi. And I mentioned in some of my other videos, I believe, that initially I had heard that Burundi was going to have a multi-sensory experience, and they did have, during one of my visits, someone passing out coffee beans that you could taste. But it wasn't as multi-sensory as I expected, certainly not in comparison with, say, Morocco, which I think really was the most multi-sensory pavilion at World Expo. And there are the coffee beans there, which I did end up trying. So Walking out, you see that informational plaque we looked at earlier. Again, you can get a sense here the crowds are just crazy right now. Okay, now we're heading into Yemen. And you know, obviously, I was reading the guide here on Yemen, and it was talking about the importance of coffee, and you can see that's clearly indicated on the wall with some of the signage. I'm assuming they're missing a letter there. I think it's honey. Oh, but yeah, it must be honey. That was kind of funny. It was the only moment in a Expo Pavilion where someone was trying to sell me something. I was kind of shocked when it happened. He wanted me to try on a bracelet or something. So you know, again, I guess it's this is going to vary with each pavilion, but I found it a little bit shocking only because I wasn't used to that. Inside Yemen, first and only hard sell of consumable items at the Expo, as they were trying to. Guy was trying to get me to try on a bracelet, I guess. I don't wear jewelry, so yeah, you know. But I guess there's always a need to make a buck here at the Expo. I mean, again, it's a reflection on the commodified nature, I think, of World Expos today. Okay, and we'll continue the tour. We're going to look here at the Dominican Republic next. And you can see they've done some really colorful design here at the entrance. What struck me about the clusters is that so many of the pavilions were so small that it was often a challenge, I think, to develop anything thematic. So certainly props to all the designers involved in a lot of these examples of you know, working on small pavilions. Okay, next up is Rwanda, and I was reading in the guide how, in addition to focusing on the priorities of coffee and tea, they said here that investors can obtain information required about the dynamic sectors of the national economy. And I think that's one of the things that is always a part of an expo, is that you're trying to promote your culture, your country, your people, and in some cases tourism and investment. So I think it does offer an opportunity for particularly smaller nations to express this to the world in terms of hoping to gain some investments or tourism. Again, I think you can see here that buildings are incredibly striking. I mean, certainly very, for me, reminiscent of coffee, and I like what they've done here, the details. This is quite cool, I think, in terms of how they put so much into the additional features here that are reminiscent of coffee, as you can see throughout the cluster. As I'm watching the video here, it occurred to me that one of the things I really enjoyed about the approach of the clusters is that they're very open social spaces, as opposed to some of the big pavilions, which often felt closed off and kind of segregated from the world. And now we're entering Ethiopia. And one of the things they did here, you could see people are taking video of it, they did a traditional Ethiopian coffee service. And the basic idea is you have to go to the counter, purchase basically a ticket, and then you come back and have a seat, because it was really crowded. There are a lot of things like this that I wanted to participate in or try out, but you know, it was just one of those factors of it being so crowded that I couldn't have that opportunity. So it's one of the things about an expo, unfortunately, is dealing with the massive numbers of people. You could see again, very, very crowded trying to get in here. A nice job though. There was the coffee section, the food. You can see it's a very popular pavilion. Just was barely able to squeeze through the crowd here. You can see on the right, people are getting their passports stamped, the Ethiopian stamp. A little bit of an appeal there, one video screen, and they did some nice things, I think, with the wall, very colorful in terms of some of the local coffee production. What I liked about this was it was a very social, you know, more of an intimate appeal to Ethiopian culture and coffee, and the fact that they did this, I think, was really quite outstanding, just because of the fact that they were trying to make it a more personal experience for the guest. I have to say I really liked what was done inside of Ethiopia. So basically turning a small pavilion into a moment, into a ritual, so showing how traditional coffee would be served. There's a charge for it, but I think it was a very nice way to approach showing more the performance side of a culture that is very heavily embedded in the world of coffee, as opposed to just showing us some of the more expected stuff that we've seen. Just behind us, of course, there's the Iley coffee, so there's a heavy corporate focus here. I'm assuming that a lot of this then was sponsored by that company, since they have their materials all over the place, and maybe that explains why this has such a more heightened look to it, as I'll show you a bit more here. Okay, now we'll be entering the Timor-Leste Pavilion. And they mention here that their concept was to show visitors the natural landscape and the territorial morphology. Okay, we're making our way out. You can see the back entrance. We're entering Uganda. And one of the things about the pavilions in all the clusters is they had the front and back entrance, which is unlike how they approach the design for the big pavilions, because they have, of course, all the queuing issues. So again, this gave an opportunity, I think, for me and other guests to be able to walk more freely through a space and not feel maybe as confined by the queuing system, by the shows in the bigger pavilions, which were all timed and dependent on very specific control of the guests' movement through the space. So leaving Uganda here. And you can also see that there's a lot of signage here as part of, I think, an attempt to create this thematic story, these 4 points that they're trying to make about coffee as you move through the journey here through the coffee cluster. And next we're going into Guatemala. See the people at the front offering the passport stamps if you want to get your book stamped. Again, I think for smaller nations, the emphasis is on creativity, as you see in this example, the coffee beans. I mentioned in my commentary just after this, it doesn't take a lot of money to do this, but it takes a lot of thought to do something like this. And so a lot of creativity, I think, went into some of the smaller nations and how they went about developing their narratives and stories in their pavilions. It was quite brilliant. I just went inside Guatemala, and super simple, doesn't cost a thing. It's just a little bit of creativity and ingenuity, taking coffee beans and having kids play with those coffee beans. I mean, it's just I think a really cool way to think about doing something that is interactive but really simple at the same time. Okay, next we're going to go into El Salvador, and actually you'll see a similar approach to using coffee beans in a creative way. So both Guatemala and El Salvador took this approach, though in Guatemala it was a little more interactive in terms of being able to at least those look like they were in place, but looks like no, the kids are able to do it as well here too. So very similar theme or approach to using coffee beans in a thematic way. And actually the same thing going on in El Salvador as well, if you had a chance to see the video there. Okay, and I'm making my way here back out towards the end of my journey through the coffee cluster. I actually had a chance to visit on a number of occasions, including at night, but I wanted to share with you the daytime footage because typically the pavilions would be closed sometimes as early as 8 o'clock, if not 9 o'clock. And again, you see this nice gathering space that they created here using coffee bean bags and the like. Very social space. Leaving the coffee cluster, I had a chance to go into, I think, most, if not all, of the nations. And, you know, something that struck me about what's presented, I mean, a lot of the cultures are showing coffee. But again, I'm wondering about the corporate sponsorship here. And I mean, one of the issues that comes up is fair trade. And unless I'm missing something, I haven't seen a single mention of fair trade. I know that Starbucks, you know, offers some fair trade options in their stores. And that's something that is kind of missing here, the politics of coffee in terms of thinking about, you know, coffee, yes, is an important part of culture, but it's also something that's used to exploit people. People aren't necessarily receiving a fair wage, and I just wanted that to be addressed at some level. Other pavilions have done this. We can think of what South Korea has suggested in terms of being reflexive and thinking about things, but that is surprisingly absent here. So it's something I wanted to see and didn't get to see here at the coffee cluster at the World Expo.